Okay, we'll keep one eye on the chat, but not both. So please bear with me if you have questions. It's probably easiest if you raise your hand, and that will catch my eye out of my peripheral vision. But nevertheless, let's get started. So group by is a great function. I'm assuming you have some familiarity with group by. And if you don't worry. I'm going to cover the basics very quickly. And if we were to look at the chart that shows the learning complexity of this session, it's going to look like this. It's going to go kind of like that. And then at the end, it's going to go up like that. So I don't blame you if you get lost either at the middle or at the end, because there's a good chance that I will get lost as well. But I hope you'll bear with me. I will share this workbook with you afterwards, and you'll be able to just kind of read through the documentation. I always think that's very much the best way to learn something. Documentation and experimentation. Those two things together can take you a long way. Okay, so group by is for creating small kind of aggregate reports. Okay, I've got some sales data here. This sales data comes from the AdventureWorks data warehouse database, and I have a SQL Server instance running on my computer, and this Power Query is pulling the data from the internet sales table, which I've got sales amount and order quantity, and a few grouping fields and a date, and that amount of data is good enough to demonstrate quite a lot of things. So this table is called V sales because it's a view, and it's a view of sales. Whenever you see V sales in the presentation, it's referring to this data, order date, category, and so on. So the very first thing that we can do is group by. You pass some row fields, and when we say row fields, they're really the grouping fields. So I want to group by the category, and I want to use the sales amount value column, and I want to apply a sum. Okay, so I'm going to sum the sales amount by category, and it gives me this. This is kind of nice. It's reduced that 60,000 row table into 4 rows. So that's simple. Now we can talk about columns, but it's actually more helpful in the longer term to think about arrays when we think about this, because really a column of a table is an array. Category is an array. Sales amount is an array. It's more helpful to think about arrays, however. And the row in this example, the row fields are actually 2 columns, but 2 columns is a single array. Okay, so it's a 2-column array, 60,000 rows from the table, and the sales amount also has the same number of rows, and the sum is just the sum function, and it still works. Okay, so the important thing to remember here is that the number of rows in the row fields must be the same as the number of rows in the values. Okay, so if those are different, group by will return an error. The columns don't have to be next to each other, but it must be a single array that you pass to the row fields. So in this example, I wanted to use the year of the order date and the category. I've created a single array from those 2 columns by using hstack. So horizontally stack them next to one another to create a 2-column array. And then, of course, the sales amount hasn't changed. So they don't have to be next to each other. And we can also use hstack to pass multiple functions. This is where things get a bit weird. The functions, you see this function parameter here. This is the 3rd parameter of group by. If you want to use sum and average, or sum, average, and min, or min, max, and average, or sum and a lambda function, as I have here, I think this is the coefficient of variation calculation, you can hstack them together. So that is to say, create a 2-column array where each element of that array contains a function. In the first element, we've got the sum function. The second element, we've got this lambda function. And a lambda function can do whatever you want it to do. In this example, it takes the parameter, which is x, it calculates the sample standard deviation of x and divides it by the average of x. And that gives you the coefficient of variation x. So x is the detail that you pass into value field. So this becomes x. X is passed into the lambda function. Then calculate the sample standard deviation, calculate the average, and then we've got the coefficient of variation. So that's just to show you two things, that you can H-stack functions and you can use lambda functions in the functions. Now, of course, the problem here, I've got two examples that are exactly the same. Okay, so the problem here is that when you use a lambda function, it just puts the word custom instead of some description of the function. So while we get a nice description of sum, we just get the word custom when we've used a lambda function. Now, if you were to use lots of lambda functions, that could be problematic. Now, there is a field headers parameter in GROUPBY, which is the fourth parameter. And if you don't pass field headers into your group fields, these are the options that you have. You can either say, okay, if field data does not have headers, in which case it would be 0, which is the default. That means that I don't have anything saying year, I don't have anything saying category, and so on. Or I can choose yes, but don't show them. So if my data that I've passed into the row fields does have headers, but I don't want to show them, I can choose yes. I can choose no, it doesn't have headers, but generate some. Or I can choose yes, it does have headers and show them. Now, in this example, my data doesn't have headers because you can see that I have passed, for example, this structured reference is a reference to the data in the order date column. If I wanted to include, if I wanted it to include the header, it would need to look different, which is the next example. And by the way, this no but generate option is kind of gives you, okay, row field 1, row field 2, value 1 and value 1, because they're both sales amounts. Now that's not super useful. So I tend to avoid that. And generally, as a rule, I try to include headers in my data, but that's not without problems either. So you can see that a structured reference to include the headers must look like this. It must have hash all in square brackets, then a comma, and then the name of the column, and all of that in square brackets. And you must do it for, because they must all of these arguments must have the same number of rows, you must do it for each structured reference in your GROUPBY function call. So I've got to do it for order date, I've got to do it for category, and I've got to do it for sales amount. What that's done here, you can see, is it's correctly brought category into the result, and it's brought sales amount into the result. But because this is a computed column, it's the year of the order date, it hasn't given me a good header for that. So that is, like I said, not without problems of its own. However, so I've identified as that as the first serious problem with GROUPBY, is that computed columns don't have reliable names. When you pass them into the row fields, you'll get a value error because there's no column header provided that is really useful. And if you pass them into the functions, then it will just use the word custom, which is not very useful either. The next thing is about subtotals. So in the 1, 2, 3, 4, in the fifth parameter, total depth, you can specify whether or not you want subtotals. And the first option is nothing, which is what I've done thus far, up to here. And then if I just want grand totals, I would enter 1. And if I want grand and subtotals, I would enter 2. And then I can choose to have them at the top if I want to by making them negative. So if I put 2, you can see that it's giving me a subtotal of each grouping field that is not the most detailed grouping field. So in this case, I've got a subtotal for year, here, 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 and one here. And I've also got my grand total. Now that's okay, but if I wanted a sum of sales amount, and then I wanted a subtotal that was average of sales amount, and another subtotal that was max of sales amount, you can't do that in GROUPBY. So that's problem number 2, which is there are limited subtotal options. Sort order is you need to really look at examples to understand sort order. So I'm going to open Excel Labs. Okay, so the sort order is this parameter here. Now, what it says in the documentation is that you provide an integer, a number of the position of the column that you want to sort by. So I have 4 columns in my result here, 1, 2, 3, and 4. If I provide 1 as the sort order, it will sort by year ascending order. Save that, change that. Done wrong. Failed. In here somewhere. This is not good. Try changing it here. I don't know why that went wrong. But I changed it to 1. Okay, so it's sorted by year. If I change it to 2, it will sort by category. Should sort by category. Using the right sort order. 2. All right, yeah. So the other thing to consider is that there is a parameter at the end called field relationship. The default for that parameter is, jump forward to that actually. So the default for that parameter is hierarchy. Okay, so field relationship, default is hierarchy, and you can set it to 1 if you want, which is table. Now, if you just leave it as the default value, it will sort grouping fields within higher level grouping fields. So in the example we were just looking at, this example, the reason that it looked like it didn't change when I changed it to sort by category is because it's actually sorting the categories within each year. So this is sorting within 2000, these are sorting within 2012, these are sorting within 2013, and this is sorting within 2014. Now, if I change that field relationship to 1, it will sort the category field across the entire table, like that. Okay, so now all the accessories are first, all the bikes are second, all the clothing is third. The other thing with sort order is if you want to sort in descending order, you would put a negative value. So this is now sorting in descending order within years. And you can also do the same with the value field. So to sort by descending sum of sales amount, I would put -3 because that's the third field, negative for descending. Now it's sorting within, well, it actually looks like it's sorting across the entire table, not within the years. So that's interesting. I didn't expect that. Okay, so other things you can do is you can choose to sort by, let's say year, and then say year descending and category descending. You can put an array of column indices like that. So year descending, so 2014 is first, and category descending as well. If you want to put an array like this, you cannot combine it with sort orders of the value fields. If I try to put -3 in here, it won't work. So that it says so in the documentation. Sort order, a vector of numbers can be provided when sorting based on only row fields. So vector is just a one-dimensional array. So that says the same thing. Let's change, just remove that now. Let's move on. The filter array is an expression that you pass into this parameter, and it creates a Boolean vector or a Boolean array that has the same number of rows as your other parameters. So there's about 60,000 rows in these row fields and 60,000 rows in the sales amount. And because this is an expression based on the same table, there are 60,000 rows in the vector returned by this expression, and it's saying, is the month of the order date less than 7, which is to say, is it January through June? And by passing that filter expression into this parameter is called filter array. By passing it there, the filter is applied before the grouping happens. And so the results that we have in this table here are based only on January through June. So obviously in 2010, there were no January through June sales. So that's filter array, and I've already explained the table hierarchy parameter. Okay, so next, I've highlighted a few issues here. Difficulty in controlling field names, limited subtotal options, and limited sorting options. Okay, so the reason I say limited sorting options is that you pretty much have an option to sort in ascending order or in descending order. You don't have an option to sort in a custom order. Okay, so that to me is kind of an oversight, slightly problematic. It's actually not that easy to solve either, as we will see. But let's move on. So we can pass multiple functions to group by using hstack, as I mentioned before. So in this example, I'm passing sum, average, and minimum, and I'm passing a single value field, sales amount. Now, when I do that, if I've got a single value field and multiple functions, then the value field will be duplicated once for each of the functions, which is to say the value field is broadcast across the array of functions, and then the function is applied to its own duplicate of that value field. And the result is that we get sum of sales amount, average of sales amount, and min of sales amount by whatever grouping field. Okay, so that works. If you've got one value field and multiple functions, it broadcasts automatically. Further to that, you can, instead of using hstack on your array of functions, which is a horizontal array of functions, you can change that to vstack. And when you do that, you'll get a vertical array of functions, and the functions will be on the rows of your result and not on the columns as they are here. So because I've got one value field, it has broadcast it in the same way that it did before, but because the array of functions is vertical, the result is vertical. So accessories has 3 rows, bikes has 3 rows, clothing has 3 rows, and the total has 3 rows. This is all good. This is easy now. If you pass multiple value fields, single function, simple. I've passed sales amount and order quantity, which is 5th and 6th columns from the sales table. And I've passed the function sum. So in this case, the sum function is broadcast across the array of value fields. So one duplication of sum for each value field. And then it applies the sum to the value field and we get the result. This is all good. Further to this, and this is where it starts to get a bit unintuitive, I think, is that if I have 2 value fields, in this example, sales amount and order quantity, and I have 2 functions, then the functions are assigned to the value fields in the order that they appear. So sum is assigned to column 5, which is sales amount. Average is assigned to column 6, which is order quantity. Okay, so in this case, because the number of functions, the number of value fields is the same, there is no broadcasting that happens. What actually happens is they are assigned respectively to one another. So if you know that that's what happens, then that's fine. But if you were expecting it to duplicate sum and average for each of sales amount and order quantity, that's not what happens. So to me, that's not intuitive based on the previous example. The next example is to show you what you need to do in order to have that broadcasting behavior. So if I want sum of and average of both sales amount and order quantity, I have to duplicate both in order that I have the same number of value fields and the same number of functions, and that they are aligned with one another. So here I have defined value fields as choosing the fifth column, the sixth column, and the sixth column, which is to say sales amount, order quantity. And then I've defined my array of functions to be sum, average, sum, average. And because of what I said here about them being assigned respectively, this report works because sum is assigned to the first one, average to the second one, sum to the third one, and average to the fourth one. So that works, but you can see that when you start having to duplicate things like this, it can get a bit tedious, and it becomes much easier to make mistakes when you're defining your choose calls and defining your H-stack. So what if I want 3 functions and 2 value fields? Well, it doesn't work because it can't assign 3 functions to 2 value fields. What I would need to do that is to repeat column 5 3 times and repeat column 6 3 times, then repeat the 3 functions twice, sum, average, max, so that I've got 6 elements in each of the value fields and the functions. And the result is then what you would expect. But as I said before, it's this duplicating of 555, 666, and this duplicating of the function names, which can be a bit tedious, and it will make it easier to make mistakes. So that is problem 4, which is it's difficult to align functions and values. There's going to be a solution for that in a minute. This to me is the biggest problem, but it's also quite easily solved. If I have multiple functions on rows, because I've used VStack, and I've got multiple values, I've got sales amount and order quantity. If I've used VStack on the functions, it doesn't just put the functions on the rows, it also puts the values on the rows. Even though the values are selected into the data set horizontally using choose calls, it transposes the values as well. So to me, that is an oversight. That is not ideal behavior in my opinion. That's problem number 5. The functions are on rows, values are transposed at the same time. So I kind of combined the problems that I mentioned into this list using a couple of trim range references. And you can see that I was working through solving them, and I kind of got halfway through limited subtotal options before I had to start the call. So I think there will be enough to talk about with just these 3 though. So the first one to talk about is this problem of difficulty to align functions and values. And to do that, we are going to build a broadcasting function. So to make that broadcasting of 3 functions, 2 values, or 2 functions and 3 values, or 5 functions and 2 values, we're going to make that automatic. Maybe now's a good time to ask if anyone's got any questions. Okay, so here's the first example. Now, this is from the previous sheet. I've repeated the value fields 3 times for each of the 3 functions, and I've repeated the functions twice for each of the value fields. So we're trying to avoid having to do that. Now, because when you try to display a function in a cell, it doesn't like it. So if I do this, if I say like sum, average, and max, if I do that, first of all, that doesn't work. I forgot I'm not allowed to do that. To use H-stack. It shows calc errors because the cell formula result is a function. So for some of the demonstrations, you'll see that I'm using function names just to make it clear for the demonstration. So in this example, I have just taken the first 5 rows of those duplicated value fields. And I've got my function names, which I've just defined once. Now, in order to in order to duplicate those function names, I want to duplicate it the same number of times as I have value fields. And I have 2 value fields. So in a very naive way, I can duplicate my function names using hstack by stacking it to itself. Okay, stacked some average max and some average max. That's a very simple way of doing it. Then I've stuck the value fields underneath, and you can think of this as the function that gets applied to the column below. Average of sales amount, max of sales amount, sum, and so on. So we want to create a function that will repeat the value fields for each function. So that if we have 3 functions, we have 3 copies of each value field, or more generally, if we have n functions, we want n copies of each value field. What we're trying to do is build an array of values, an array of value fields, which is 3 of sales amount and 3 of order quantity, based solely on the count of the functions in the functions array. This is a lot of words. It might be more helpful to look at an example. Okay, so broadcast builder is a lot of code because it's we're going to step through it and look at what happens. First of all, I'm passing all the data into this data variable because it's easier to refer to that way, and I'm selecting the second column from the data, which is the category. And here I'm selecting sales amount and order quantity, which is the 5th and 6th columns from the data. And I'm defining 3 functions. And for ease of explanation, the function names of those functions. Okay, so the naive way to do it that we've seen is to repeat the function names using hstack. But that's not scalable because you don't know how many times you would need to apply hstack until the function is called. So you can't really hard code it that way, but that is the principle of what the code will produce. Now this is something I've called dynamic repeated function names, which is a way of building this hstack dynamically. So reduce, I can't get into the details of how reduce works. I hope you understand how reduce works already. You start with a value. So in this case, I'm starting with the function names. I'm starting with this horizontal array of function names. And then I'm describing an array, which is the number of value fields minus 1. It's minus 1 because I'm starting with 1 copy of the function names. And let's say if I had 4 value fields, this sequence would be 4 minus 1, so it would be a sequence of 3. It would be an array of 3 elements, which is in reduce is saying I want to apply this function 3 times. And the function is saying, okay, horizontally stack the accumulated value of the function, which is whatever the array is after the current iteration. The first iteration, it is the initial value, which is the 3 function names. Horizontally stack it with itself. Then pass the result of that to the next iteration. And then it will stack function names to the result of the first iteration. And it will do that 3 times, or twice in this example, so that dynamic repeated function names, use that as the result. See that it has repeated it times. I'm not sure why I'm getting these save errors.
You need to enable your content. You got that security warning.
Yeah, it was working earlier with it not enabled, but I guess I can. I have a problem with the add-in. Might be an error somewhere else in the workbook. Just all kinds of problems. But anyway, it did change when I updated it. So it's now it's showing us dynamic repeated function names. Now, if the number of value fields was, say, there were 4 value fields, do that because there's not enough space. So hopefully you can see that this expression here has repeated dynamically based on the count of value fields is repeated function names array. The exact number of times that it needs to be repeated. So it's repeated it, 2 copies of it. Now that's all well and good, but if we want things to be a bit more abstract so that we can reuse the code, we can use a Lambda function. And the first Lambda function of today is this broadcast 1, which is taking the code from up here, this reduce call, and it's embedding it in a Lambda function with 2 parameters. First of all, the array, and second of all, the number of times that we want to repeat the array. So this code is very much the same as this reduce call here, except instead of function names, it's just array. And instead of calculating the columns of the value fields, I've passed this parameter called times. Otherwise, it's exactly the same. So it's start with the array, repeat it for the number of times minus 1, and then execute this Lambda function over this sequence, once per element of the sequence. Now, it actually doesn't matter that these are integers or where they start from or what the values of the sequence are. All that matters is the length of the sequence. And arguably, you could create the array that goes into this parameter here in any way you want, as long as it's got the number of elements in it that you want to repeat the function for. That's a long way of saying value of the sequence doesn't matter because it's not used. You can see this cur function is not used here, which it's not used. Okay, so if we use broadcast 1, and there's a line down here that tests how that's used. So test broadcast 1. It's broadcasting the function names for 2 value fields. Okay. Bit worried about that error. The next one, now that we've been able to repeat the function names, we need to be able to repeat the value fields as well. So I want to step through some kind of simple examples. First of all, to repeat a value field, so value field 1, for example, I can use this expression, and I can repeat 1 3 times by using choose calls value fields 1 1 1. That will give me column 1 of the value fields 3 times. For the value fields, it's a 2-column array of sales amount and order quantity. So this will give me sales amount 3 times. Okay, sales amount 3 times. It's working even though there's an error. This does the same thing. The only difference here is that this is now a single parameter, but it's a parameter that is an array. Am I still sharing? Yes. Okay. It's a single parameter, but it's a parameter field that it's a parameter that is an array of 3 values. And because we can pass an array of 3 values to get 3 columns, we can build that array using an expression. And in this example, we are building the array of 3 ones using the expand function, which begins with a 1 and repeats it this number of times and fills the values with a 1. So it's not too hard to see that expand 1 for columns of funcs, and there are three columns, will create an array that is 3 columns, 1 row, and filled with 1s. So this produces the same result, which is it returns sales amount 3 times. Now, if I want to return order quantity 3 times, all I have to do is change the first parameter and the last parameter of expand to a 2. So repeated value fields 4. If I were to show you what that looks like, it will return order quantity 3 times, like that. Okay, so that's all well and good, but this is not very scalable either. If I want to return all of the value fields, I can H-stack them together. Okay, so that's 3 ones, that's 3 twos, so 3 sales amount and 3 order quantity. But of course, that's not very scalable. So we can go to another example of using reduce, in this case, to repeat the value fields. So reduce here is starting with a 0, the details of which I don't want to get into. And it's saying for the columns in the array, repeat this expression that many times. Then this call to drop just gets rid of this 0. If we had time, I would explain why, but I'm not going to, because it doesn't make sense. But you can see that the inner expression that is being stacked with the accumulated value of the reduce function is one of these expressions up here, where the first and last arguments of expand are replaced with the current value of the sequence of the sequence of column indices for the array. A long way of saying column 1 and column 2. First, repeat this for column 1, then repeat it for column 2, and then drop the column that contains 0 from the end. And we can test that with test broadcast 2. Okay, so now it's repeated sales amount and order quantity 3 times. This is how it's called. Value fields, and repeat it this number of times, which is to say 3 times. Repeat each value field 3 times. Okay, so that's broadcast 2. And broadcast 3 attempts to combine broadcast 1 and broadcast 2, which is by using this order parameter. Now, you've noticed that there are 2 ways of repeating things. We can either repeat sales amount, sales amount, sales amount, quantity, 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 or we can repeat sales amount, quantity, sales amount, quantity, sales amount, quantity. So that's 2 ways of repeating. And so that is controlled by this order parameter. And if order is set to 0, it will do the first thing that we saw with broadcast 1, which is to say sum average max, sum average max. And if order is non-zero, it will do what I just showed you with these 3 value fields, which is to say repeat the first value field 3 times and the second value field 3 times. So in that way, broadcast 3 can be used to do both, broadcasting the functions and the value fields. Test example here. We'll start by showing that it works on the function names with parameter 0. Okay, so that was the equivalent of broadcast 1. It's taken the 3 function names and repeated it. Okay, so we've got 6 columns. And if I want to do it the other way around, I can have value fields and the columns of the function names with parameter 1. And this will now repeat the value fields each 3 times. So the net result is that we can now align those 3 functions to the 3 copies of each value field. So that's broadcast 3, which is starting to get a bit more complex, but it actually doesn't need to be this complex. You'll be pleased to hear. Yeah, Peter, I will look into that. It's kind of it's probably better, but we'll continue down this road for now. So you'll notice that in broadcast 3, these calls to reduce are different. So one of them has an array in the first position, then it repeats a number of times -1. The other one uses this drop method where it starts with a 0 and it repeats it the number of times that there are columns. Strictly speaking, that should say times in there. Just realized. And it drops the first column. So if we actually convert both of them to use this drop 0 and drop the first column method, then it would look like this. And at this point, both examples for order 0 and order 1 are of the same structure. So they both have drop, they both have reduce. The first parameter is 0. They're both dropping the first column here and here. And the difference in the array that's being reduced over is the difference between this times and the columns of the array. Okay. So we can use an if statement to switch between them. And we can use an if statement to switch between whether it uses array in the H stack or whether it uses this choose cols expression in the H stack. And we put that, if we put that in broadcast 5, it looks like this, which is simpler. So now we've got if order equals 0, it's times. Otherwise, the columns of the array. I'm now looking at this, wondering whether that's actually correct, but it works. It might not be as efficient as it could be. And then the H stack expression is saying if order is 0, stack the array. Otherwise, choose a repeated version of a particular column from that array. So broadcast 5 works for both now. So it will, first of all, if I wanted to, I could repeat the function sum, average, average, max, max, which is because I've got function names, columns of value fields, and 1. If I change that to 0, it will be sum, average, max, sum, average, max. And if I want to do it the other way around, value fields and the columns of the function names, it will be like that. And if I change it to 1, like that. Okay, so this broadcast 5 is now pretty flexible. That's this function here. So I'm going to take that function and I'm putting it in this group by module. And I've added a bit of logic to it. Let me close this. This is the broadcast function in the X group by module. And I've added some logic here to just ensure that what's being passed into the parameters are the right shape and the right size. And if either of X and Y are only one column, then the broadcasting happens automatically, as I mentioned before. So it just returns the array and doesn't do any broadcasting. Otherwise, it repeats the logic from that broadcast 5 function. So this X group by dot broadcast can now be called like that. And that's quite flexible and it can be used in several times, in several ways. Okay, we've already lost 2 people, fine. So that's the broadcast function. And as you've seen from the errors that we saw before, it is a useful function to have, even if it is not so simple to build up from first principles. And Peter has suggested another option in there. Okay, so this is what happens when I use X group by dot broadcast. You can see that instead of passing the value fields as they are to the group by function, I'm passing them through this broadcast function so that they are the same shape. And I'm doing it for the value fields, for the functions as well as the value fields. The result being that I now have 3 functions for each of the value fields. Okay, so yes, it was annoying to build the broadcast function and figure it out and make sure that it works. But now that it does work, I can reuse it wherever I want. And every time I use group by, if I want to have these non-standard configurations, I can use the broadcast function to make sure that they work without having to think about the logic and without having to repeat 555, 666, and so on. Okay. Any questions? Thanks, Celia. Have a good lunch. Okay, so I'm going to move on to pivots and sorts. Okay, so from the last sheet, we've broadcast 3 functions over 2 value fields, and that kind of works. However, and I've converted that, by the way, this logic here which is the group fields, and then the broadcast values and the broadcast functions. This is going to be quite useful to repeat over and over and over again. So I can actually wrap that logic into another function, which I have called report one, or everything below report one for now. And report one is literally just taking the group fields, the value fields, and the functions, and it is passing them into this call to group by, where it is applying the broadcasting and returning the output. And so the formula that we use to do that is now just, okay, define what I want to do and pass it into this report one function. Okay, so I mean, that's all well and good. However, if I VStack my functions, the broadcasting will still work. So now I've got 6 rows for each category. But as I mentioned in an earlier sheet, the value fields are transposed as well. And I don't really want that to happen. So the broadcasting in report one is still working, but VStack makes the value fields transpose. So I need to fix that. And the first thing to do to fix that is, okay, so I drop the first row from that call to report one. This is the first row. Okay, so it's not actually super useful because it's only got the word category and then 3 blanks. So we drop that. And then we use PIVOTBY to pivot value field, which is this one here, columns. So we take the first 2 columns, this table, which is the accessories, bytes, clothing, and then the function names. Those are the first 2 columns. And those are the row fields in PIVOTBY. The column fields in PIVOTBY is the 3rd column, which is the sales amount, order quantity, this column here. And then the value field is the last column, which is this column here. And we can get the last column using take and -1. And if we put all of that into PIVOTBY, we can get a better looking report, which is to say, for each category, 3 functions across 2 values. Now, that's good, but it's not as good as I'd like it to be, because it has resorted the function names and it has resorted the value fields. So if you recall, sales amount should be first, order quantity second, and the order of the functions should be sum, average, max, and it's changed it to average, max, sum. This is the behavior of PIVOTBY. It automatically resorts the data as you pivot the data. I'm sure there's a good reason for it. I don't know what it is. So we're going to fix that. But because we've made a step towards a solution, i.e. we've added this PIVOTBY logic, I have created report 2. Report 2 is called like this. And report 2 bakes the pivot logic into the code. So if the number of rows of the function array is 1, then it's been H-stacked and we can just use the group by. Okay. If it's not 1, then it's been V-stacked and we need to apply a PIVOTBY as well, which is what happens here. So it passes the result of the group by, which has the broadcasting, drops the first row, defines the group columns, and then creates the PIVOTBY as we saw in the previous formula. And that's xgroupby.report2, which will automatically do this pivoting of the value fields if the function array is vertical. Formula looks like this. So it's now quite simple, selecting 1 group and column, 2 value columns, a vertical stack of functions, and a simple call to report 2 to return a report that looks like that. So I want to resort those functions though, and I want to resort the value columns. And to do that, using report 3, and report 3 looks like this. Report 3 looks like this, and what the thing that it's doing differently is that instead of passing the columns and the grouping columns and the columns into PIVOTBY as they are, it's passing them through this add sort index function. And what add sort index does is it takes the data as it is and it applies an integer to each unique value in the data as it is. So to give you an example of how that works, add sort index, and let's just pass in this column of function names. See that it's assigned 1 to average, 2 to max. That's not actually not what I want to do. From original, do it here. It takes the original order of the functions and assigns the integer based on the original order, so that sum is 1, average is 2, and max is 3. And it repeats it wherever it finds those values. And the reason we do that, the way that we do that, I should say, is kind of simple. First of all, to account for the fact that the data that you pass into the add sort index function might have 2 columns, you concatenate the columns into a single column so that you've got 1 value per row. And as an example of what that looks like, by row, if I take by row of these and I put concat in there, it will pass accessories and sum into the concat function and create a single value from them. And then the next row, accessories and average into the concat function, create a single value from those, and so on and so forth to the bottom of the array, so that you get this. And these are now unique values for that array. If I pass, and therefore if I use add sort index for those 2 columns, you can see that accessories sum is 1 here and here, repeated twice in this input array because we've got 2 value fields. Okay. Bike sum is 4 here and here, and clothing sum is 7 here and here, and so on. Okay, so that's really what add sort index does, is that it adds an integer position to the unique combinations that represent a row, and it does it like this. There may be a better way to do it, but that's the way that I did it. Okay, so getting back to the point, is that report number 3, which is here, is adding the sort index to the group fields that are passed into PIVOTBY, which is these 2 here. Okay, so now we have a unique row, a unique ID per row, and we're also applying that function to the value fields, which is to say that sales amount gets assigned 1, and order quantity gets assigned to 2. When you pass, when the first row or column that you pass into PIVOTBY is numeric like this, it will define the sort order of what comes out at the other end of PIVOTBY. And so now that the row fields is this array, it's sorted by this first column, which is to say that accessories is at the top with sum, average, and max, and then bike, sum, average, and max. Similarly, now that the column fields pass into PIVOTBY are these 2, sales amount will appear first because it's sorted by the first row. So that's how you sort the columns in PIVOTBY. And then to get rid of that, report 4 just applies this drops the first column, or the first row in the first column. And now report 4 has properly sorted the functions as they were originally passed into the call, and these value fields as they were extracted from the table. And so now this somewhat short formula compared to the others is giving me a report that looks close to what I want it to be, which is I just wanted a single grouping field. I wanted 2 value fields. I want 3 functions. I want them to be broadcast automatically, and I want the functions on rows. You may be familiar with doing this kind of thing in a pivot table. And I saw a question in the chat, like, why would you bother doing this when you can use a pivot table? Well, as of today, there is no way to pass the range of a pivot table dynamically into a formula and do other calculations on it and reliably know that when the pivot table changes shape, so will the dynamic array in the formula. There's no way, there is no dynamic reference to a pivot table. I think Peter said that. So there are ways that we can get around that using the group by function. Now the result of this X group by report 4 can be passed into any other calculation that I want. I can split it up, tear it apart, put it in the four corners of the spreadsheet. But the point is now dynamic. Okay, any questions? The silence is telling. Okay, things are getting a bit complex. This is the vertical part of the learning curve. Okay, so I went on from here and I thought, okay, I need to find a solution for subtotals. And I'm going to warn you that I did not get all the way to a complete solution, but I did get quite far. And it may be that I just put this entire module up on GitHub and people who are smarter than me can fork it and find a solution for the subtotals where I was not able to. But let's just talk about subtotals for a second. So I've got report 4 was the one that we just looked at, which has the sorted pivot by, which puts the value fields in the right place. And then report 5 is very much the same thing, except after that pivot by, you've got an extra parameter to the function called subtotal funcs. It's optional. And if you want subtotals, you can pass an array of subtotal functions. And the following code will calculate those subtotals and stack them with the original results of the pivot by operation that we saw previously. So this example is using report 5. Now I was testing it with a lot more group fields. I used the year of the order date, and I'm using the category and the subcategory. And then this was kind of a simpler test of group fields 2. And then for the value fields, I've again got sales amount and order quantity. For the functions, I'm just using sum of both of these just to keep things simple. And then for the subtotal functions, I want subtotals of sum, average, min, and max. The result of this is that if we were using report 4, we would get all of that. All of this. So this would be this highlighted part would be the result of report 4. And then the subtotals have been calculated recursively on each level of grouping within the group fields. Okay, so 2010 bikes. These are the subtotals for 2010 bikes. Underneath that, the subtotals for 2010. Then it's the subtotals for 2011 bikes. And then underneath that, the subtotals for 2011. Okay, so this is hopefully making sense. Subtotals for accessories, bikes, and clothing, and then the subtotals for 2012, and so on and so forth, all the way down until we have a subtotals for the entire table. It was actually not that simple to solve. And I did it with a function called subtotals, funnily enough. So I say, if the user has omitted subtotal functions, then we're just going to return the original result, which I've called detailed group by. Detailed group by is this. It's that called a pivot by. If they've omitted subtotal functions, then just return that. And actually, if there's only one group field, adding subtotals doesn't make sense because they would be identical to the results of the group field, I think. Maybe it does make sense. But anyway, I need to fix it. So in both of those cases, it just returns the result of the pivot by. Otherwise, it stacks the result of the pivot by with the result of this subtotals function. And the subtotals function takes the parameters from report 5, which we've passed in, group fields, value fields, functions, and subtotals functions. Okay, and it also takes the result of the pivot by, which is the data that it's going to use to calculate subtotals. It takes all of those parameters and it does this. So first of all, calculate some counts because we're going to need those. And we're going to count the number of functions and the number of subtotal functions. The reason I'm doing it with this count-off function is that I don't know what orientation, whether vertical or horizontal, these function arguments are at runtime. So it just does something very simple, which is to count the number of rows in the columnar representation of the array. Maybe there's a better way to do it. So those are just counts, which are used later. Now I take the header off. Remember, we're passing into this function this data here. This highlighted data is what is being passed into this subtotals function, including the header. So the first thing to do is to get rid of the header because that's going to confuse things. The next thing is to calculate the. So the way this subtotal function works, I've realized that I've not got straight how to explain this in my head. The way this subtotal function works is that it successively replaces columns in the input array with the word total. And it stacks them underneath each other so that you end up with a big array of the same data essentially repeated as many times as there are row fields, so 3 times, with exactly the same values. And it creates this big stacked array and then passes that back into port 5. But because it's got the word total all the way down in one column, or in both columns, or in all 3 columns, the result of report 5 will collapse them all and essentially apply the aggregates to that new data set. And the way we do that replacement, I mean, this is probably not the best way to do it, but the way I've done it is to say, okay, I'm going to take the first group cols count -1 columns and stack it next to the value columns. I actually don't recall why. And then calculate the last level, which is to say total across all 3 rows or all 3 columns. Everybody's leaving now. And then to calculate the middle levels, we use a reduce operation. And the reduce operation is essentially for as many grouping fields as you have, successively replace a column with the word total, such that at the end, you can stack them all together, which is if you have no detail levels, you can just put the first level and the last level. There's always at least one level, and you can always calculate the last level because the last level is just all of the data. And the first level is just at least one grouping field. If there are no detail levels, which is to say that this reduce operation returns an empty array, then it returns an error. So you just return the first and the last levels. Otherwise, you stack the first level, middle levels, and the last levels on top of one another and pass them all back into report number 5 with the subtotal functions as the functions argument. Which means when it goes back into report number 5, it will calculate all of this stuff for those subtotal functions, and then it will get here. It will find that the subtotal functions in that call is omitted, and it will just return the subtotals. I hope that makes sense. Yeah, it probably doesn't. Okay, so that's what this subtotals turns. Yeah, right. That's subtotals. So the net result is that we are recursing. We are passing subtotals back into report 5, but it is not recalling subtotals because we are omitting the subtotal funcs argument from that call to report 5. And then it is dropping the first row from the subtotals, passing it back here where it is stacked underneath the detail. This being the detail, as I mentioned before, and this, all of this down here being the result of the subtotals function. Okay, so I think I'm going to stop there because the next thing that I needed to do, which I wasn't able to crack in time, is to properly sort the subtotals into the detail. Okay, and the reason this is so complex is because we want to find a solution that solves for an unknown number of group fields. If you just wanted to solve for 1 or 2, it would be very easy. But if you want an unknown number of group fields, you need to handle things like empty arrays from hstack and empty arrays from reduce. And that's where things get kind of tricky. So sorting them, I got into a point where, okay, I can take the row fields and I can use this all sort indices function. All sort indices is here, and it is just applying the sort index function over and over again to the data that you pass into it. So I've done that here, and that's correctly assigned the indices to the 3 columns of the detail or of the subtotals. And then if I were to sort by those sort indices, it would correctly sort bikes, 2 detail rows of the bikes, then the subtotals of the bikes, and then the totals of the bikes in 2010. And in a better example, in 2012, it would be the details of the bikes and then the subtotals of the bikes, and then the details of the accessories, and then the subtotals of the accessories, details of the clothing and the subtotals of the clothing, and then the subtotals for 2012. So I think I'm on the right track with assigning these indices and then sorting. I just didn't get far enough along to kind of fold it back into the main report. So let me stop talking. And if anyone's got any questions or wants me to cover anything that I've talked about in a more detail or with a better explanation, please let's talk about it now.
A bewildering tour of force. Struggling there at times to keep up.
Yeah, me too. I think my mouth was going faster than my brain, unfortunately.
I wonder whether sometimes it'd be better to put out more tables rather than putting more and more mixed contents within a table.
Yeah, possibly. I mean, it was more a case of I kind of got the bit between my teeth of this subtotals problem, and I wanted to see how far I could go with it. It may be that actually having different aggregates stacked beneath another function is not always a good idea. So if these are always sums,
you've done it though.
I've definitely seen it done in a business context, pivot table. So I thought, okay, is it possible with group by? The answer is yes, but easily. Bo says bisection would work well for the subtotal.
I didn't understand that.
Well, I mean, I think any place that you use the reduce stack pattern, you can use your bisection pattern.
I'm with you. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, you could probably replace all of the calls to reduce and stack with the bisect function. I'm just not as familiar with it, so I didn't do that. So this is part of the reason that I've used this X group by module, is because I've got a lot of related functions that are used by one another, and it's useful to keep them all together. Now, if I were to finish this up, which I will certainly try to do, I will get rid of all of the earlier iterations of report and just change report 5 to report. Of course, one of the problems with doing this is that by introducing new functionality, you necessarily have to remove other functionality. Otherwise, it gets horrendously complicated. So, for example, if I had vertically stacked functions, multiple functions for sales amount and order quantity, and then I passed a different list of functions to the subtotal functions, what would such a table look like? And would it actually even make sense? So it's those kinds of decisions that you have to make when you're doing something like this. And in my case, I just said, okay, if you've got more than one normal function and you want to use multiple subtotal functions, well, you can't do that. You have to have one function and multiple subtotals, or multiple functions and one subtotal. I think I maybe didn't even cover that, but certainly that's what I would do. Okay. Well, thanks everybody. Thanks for coming. I did actually put 2 hours down for this, but I think I'm up steam and content, as you can see. So thank you for hanging around. I'll have a go at fixing all of the things that are wrong with this and maybe share it with you all.
Hi, Owen.
So have a good day.
Hi, Owen.
Hi.
Yeah, good evening from here in Nigeria. So I just want to confirm the session is recorded and will be shared too, because I joined in late, so I wasn't able to catch up with as much as you were doing. So I just want to confirm the session is recorded and would be, shared across your platform on LinkedIn.
Yeah, certainly. I'm recording it and I will share it. It will be on YouTube and I'll share a link on LinkedIn.
On YouTube, yeah?
Yep.
All right, awesome. Really, really insightful. I was lost along you because I joined in late, but yeah, I would appreciate the shared session. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah. To me, all of this work is not necessarily about the perfect solution, but rather the thinking that goes into creating one version of a solution. Like Bo will come up with something else and Peter will come up with something else, but it's that step-by-step grasping of different problems and seeing how you can fold those problems into your function. I think that's the useful exercise. Okay, definitely stopping the recording now. Thank you, everybody.
Some really good material there. Thank you very much, Owen.
I appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Owen.
Peter. Have a good day, everybody.
Thanks, Owen. Bye.